Macroeconomics, lecture 20. Today's lecture is on business cycles, introduction. What I have done for you guys is use Ben Bernanke's textbook, Macroeconomics, and take for you a chapter which I have simplified so that you can understand what a business cycle is. We're not trying today to explain causes, consequences, etc. of a business cycle. We're simply trying to describe this beast as it is. So first, we got to say how we call this beast. And it is called, number one, business cycles. We also use what has been used throughout the last 2 centuries, boom-bust. Boom-bust cycle. And in more modern days, in the recent decades, it is simply called the economic cycle. Okay, so first of all, before we go any further, we have to differentiate between a business cycle and a business fluctuation. So we have point number 2, business cycle versus business fluctuation. The most important characteristic of a business cycle that differentiates it from a fluctuation is that the business cycle is repetitive. So we have as a characteristic repetitive, and a business fluctuation is a one-time event. So it's a one-time event and is related to a one-time occurrence in the economy. Now, both business cycles and business fluctuations affect the whole economy, not just a particular sector, but a whole economy. So, question that I have for you, what do you think may be examples of a business fluctuation? In other words, what may cause a major swing into the economy? Usually a negative swing, but possibly also positive, that can affect the whole economy. A war, a disaster. Okay, so case number 1 for a business fluctuation will be a war. A war will definitely swing an economy into a recession or a depression. You may experience before that a boom time economy related to a war, as was the case of World War II, related to or after the Great Depression. So you may have a boom, war boom. Another one was natural disaster. Let's give a couple of examples of disasters that can cause a business fluctuation. A lightning, earthquake that affects the whole economy in a major way. Another one will be a tsunami that can cause a major problem. The classical example, and we call it with A, is a Katrina. A Katrina. Katrina is symbolic of a natural phenomenon, natural disaster that can spread widely to the point of affecting in a major way the whole economy. Back in older days, you have pest. You know what's pest? Well, it's a disease, massive disease that can wipe out major agricultural crops. So agricultural crops in a major, massive way. So back in the old days in agricultural economies, that could be the case. Well, what about some positive effects? What could be positive that can have a major effect on the economy in a positive way? Well, first and foremost could be a major technological breakthrough. For example, computers in the 60s. For example, internet in the 90s. For a little economy, a one-time event may be discovering a major oil field, major relative to a small economy. So that could be an example of a positive effect. So usually a fluctuation, let's summarize, is based on a one-time event, which we call a one-time shock. That shock is usually negative in nature, but could easily be positive under good, appropriate circumstances. So is it fairly clear the difference between a cycle and a fluctuation? Cycle is repetitive, occurs over and over and over again, and I'll get some more later today. Okay, so the next issue to discuss is the problems or the fundamental problems that a business cycle theory must explain. In other words, a business cycle has a lot of things to explain, but three of them seem to be harder to explain than other things, and I'll explain those three things. So 3A is explain cluster of entrepreneurial errors. It turns out that during a boom, lots of investments are made, and during the bust, it is discovered or realized that those or many of those investments were made in error. They were made erroneously to the point that they cannot pay for themselves. In other words, not only they provide subpar returns, many of them actually provide negative returns. We simply call these losses. But many of them cannot sustain themselves to the point where the business that made those investments simply has to go bankrupt. So the point is that these investments are usually done by capitalists and entrepreneurs, and the most important characteristic of an entrepreneur is that he is an expert in forecasting, and he's an expert in allocating capital efficiently and appropriately. What is important also to understand about entrepreneurs is that they are subject to the survival of the fittest. Survival of the fittest is the Darwinian notion that those that are the best in the entrepreneurial business survive and their capital grows, and those that are not good and don't make good entrepreneurial decisions go bankrupt and make those decisions no more. So entrepreneurs are by their very nature good or excellent or outstanding forecasters. Those that are not good don't survive at all. So survivability makes them top forecasters. Yet when a boom occurs, and then when the bust comes, it turns out that the bulk or the majority of those entrepreneurs all got it wrong. During the 90s, that will be the dot-com boom. And dot-coms were making these wild investments, and entrepreneurs were making these wild investments. Similarly with telecoms, but as we realized in the early 2000s, especially 2001, 2, and maybe later in 2003, what was realized is that most of those investments were made in error. So problem number one is, how come that businessmen, meaning entrepreneurs, are so remarkably skillful at forecasting, yet they get fooled during the business cycle to invest into ultimately what will prove to be unprofitable businesses? These investments, incidentally, we call malinvestments. All right? So that's number one, kind of like a paradox, a real hard thing to explain. Number two to explain is rising consumer prices during the boom. In other words, booms are usually characterized by rising consumer prices. We call this price inflation. Many economists simply call this inflation. So, it is one of a repetitive feature observed in every single boom that consumer prices rise. Sometimes they may be steady, but they in general rise. And the last paradox to explain that is repetitive and characteristic of every business cycle is that high order goods prices, or the prices of high order goods, rise relative to prices of low order capital goods. So the price of the one relative to the price of the other increases. Now, let's remind from our capital and interest lecture that high order capital goods prices are capital goods that are removed farthest from the consumer. Symbolic of these are real estate prices. They are also buildings, capital, equipment. Land will be in that category, and stock prices. Low order capital goods prices are those prices of those capital goods that are closest to the consumer. So what happens during a boom is that those capital goods farthest removed from the consumer rise a whole lot more than those closest to the consumer. Let's put it in this way. Symbolic of this will be a toothpaste, and in this will be, let's say, an apartment. Apartments can rise or do rise a whole lot faster than toothpastes. All right? So this happens during the boom, and the reverse happens during the bust. So prices of high order capital goods relative to prices of low order capital goods go down during the bust. This is also known as the higher volatility of high order capital goods. Higher volatility because they rise faster during the boom, and they fall a lot harder during the bust. So this is the third fundamental paradox to explain, okay? All right, so then we have phases of the cycle. So one of the phases of the cycle is, we gotta move this, a little more. Okay, so phases of the cycle. The first phase, of course, is the boom phase. And the boom phase represents the upward portion of the business cycle, the upward portion of the business cycle. Then you have the peak, and the peak represents the top portion of the business cycle, the point after which the economy begins to go down, or the economy begins to contract. The third is called a bust, and this represents the lower portion of the business cycle. I'll draw a picture in a minute. In other words, this is the portion where the economy contracts, what's called the economy goes down. And at the very end, we have the trough. And the trough is simply the very bottom of the business cycle. Now, let's draw a little picture, and a little picture will be what we have on the horizontal axis is time. What we have here is GDP. And now we have the business cycle, which is fluctuating, and it fluctuates around the long-term trend line. So the long-term trend line represents long-term economic growth. This local point, which represents a local maximum, the peak here, is the peak. Another peak will be represented by this point. Is there any question that you need to answer? Okay, so this is another peak. This point here will represent the trough. So this point is the trough. The segment from the peak to the trough is called the bust. And then the segment from the trough to the peak is called the boom. A different way to think about it is that the downward portion, the portion where the curve goes down, is called the bust, and then the upward portion is called the boom. Okay? Now, we also have one more concept which is not well defined in the subject of economics, but is usually well understood intuitively, and this is the early portion from the trough before the economy really accelerates. We call this a revival. So this is the revival period. The revival period is the period right after the economy has troughed. It is in recovery mode, but it hasn't switched to another boom. In other words, it doesn't have a strong growth. A different way to think about it is that the economy has troughed and has a slow, very slow growth. In other words, the economy is growing at a rate much slower than the long-term growth. Once growth accelerates to become faster or higher than the overall long-term growth, then the economy is in booming mode. Is it fairly clear? All right, makes sense? All right, so now what we need to do is discuss some more terms or concepts for these. In other words, these are not the ones and only terms. Booms, you know, guys, how else we call them? Or how have you heard them on the literature? Or on TV, newspapers, magazines? Expansion. Excellent. That's what it is. Expansion. Okay? It is much more interesting. It is much more interesting that the bust has a whole lot more names. First, bust is a really bad word. It's been consistently used in the 19th century to the point that it has become, in the earliest 20th century, it's become relatively unacceptable. It's been still used, but it's unacceptable. The word which has been much more popular in 19th century, in earliest 20th century, is depression. Depression is simply the downward portion of the business cycle. Do you now hear a lot talking about depression and the depressionary part of the business cycle? No. And the answer is very simple. Since the Great Depression, depression is associated with truly bad, terrible things. So, depression has become a dirty word. And economists have decided no longer to use it in the economic vocabulary. So, economists come up with nicer words. A nicer word, you know, guys? Recession. Excellent. Recession. So, recession is a much nicer but still neutral word. Well, recession is not used very much these days in the early 21st century. Why? Because there was a bad recession in the 70s, and people now associate recession with the 70s. Well, it was stagflation, as we studied early in this course. So recession is not a really good word anymore. So we come up with other words. We call them euphemisms for a depression or a bust. Can you guys know? Have you heard of any one of them? Some of them? Slow down. Excellent. Excellent. That's exactly how they call it. They don't call it U.S. economy is tipping recession. Just U.S. economy is slowing down. So slow down is definitely a preferred word, especially in recent years. So slow down. When you hear a slow down, you always got to ask, are we talking about a real bust, or are we talking about the economy growing at 5% annually, slowing down to growing at 3 or 4%? Usually people would think that slow down would mean growth slowing down from 5 to 4, but in reality they would mean a negative growth. In other words, a bust, but they don't call it a bust, and they don't call it a recession. Any other terms you guys have heard? Contraction. Excellent. Contraction is also one of those words that is used quite often, but contraction is not a favorite because it, unlike slowdown, clearly shows that the economy is contracting. In other words, it is understood or implied that it's in a classical recession or a classical depression. So they have even nicer words like like soft landing. So soft landing. Soft landing implies that it's going to be really smooth and the bust will not be painful. There is another one where they really imply that the bust will be truly painful and hard, and they call it hard landing. So, hard landing. In this sense, you'd hear economists talking a lot, and the real argument will be, is it going to be a soft landing or is it going to be a hard landing? And that's where the nuances are. Keep in mind that nobody really bothers to define what exactly is soft landing and what exactly is hard landing. You see? So most of the times, without having defined these, usually the consensus is, yes, it will be always soft landing. We don't want to paint a dark picture. Is it fairly clear? All right. So let's discuss some basic characteristics of business cycles. So let's do some basic characteristics. The first one, characteristics. The first one, which I have already mentioned, is aggregate versus sectoral. So a business cycle is characterized by the aggregate economy. When you have a boom in one particular industry, this does not mean that the economy is booming. If you have a bust in one particular industry, it does not mean that the economy is in bust mode. You need the overall economy. So the boom-bust cycle is characterized by the overall activity, as it is usually measured by GDP or possibly GNP, and is not characterized by a particular sector. Moreover, what you may happen to have is that the overall economy is in a true, genuine bust mode, and you may still have one two or more sectors booming within the overall macroeconomic bust. Is it fairly clear? All right? So that's characteristic number one. Characteristic number two I mentioned already and explained, but let's have it quite clear, is that the business cycle is repetitive. So that's a second truly important characteristic. A third important characteristic is associated with co-movement of variables. Co-movement of macro variables. In other words, what you have is that if consumption is growing, very likely in a boom, investment is also growing. Very likely in a boom, employment is also growing. Very likely profitability will be growing. Very likely imports will be growing. Very likely stock prices will be rising. Real estate prices will be rising. So the point I'm trying to make is that if you get a set of key macroeconomic variables, they are likely to move in the same direction during the boom, and they are likely to move in the opposite direction during the bust. Is it fairly clear? Make sense? Okay, so co-movement of variables. Let's see what else we have. Repetitive, actually, that's a note that I have, is also known as recurrent. So it is the same thing, it's the same concept, and whether we say in English repetitive or whether we say recurrent, it provides or gives the same idea. The next fundamental characteristic of business cycles is that of aperiodicity. In other words, a business cycle is not periodic. Period is associated with a fixed length of time. Period would be considered day, and each day having 24 hours. Seasons would be considered periodic. They have roughly, let's say, 3 months. Years will be considered more or less periodic. They have roughly 365 days. When you do not have a fixed length of the periods, you simply call it aperiodic, standing for non-periodic. It simply means that the overall business cycle, let's say from peak to trough to peak again, could barely last 2 or 3 years, at least in the older days, let's say in late 18th century, but these are rare. Much likelier is to have a total of 5 to 8 years, but in late 20th centuries, business cycles have, the period for business cycle have become bigger and bigger, or larger and larger, and now it will not be uncharacteristic to have 15 to 18 years total. Let me give an example. Great Depression. We've studied the Great Depression. The boom begins in 1921, approximately, ends in 1929, that's roughly 9 years, and then the bust begins roughly 1929 and ends in, I don't know, 40, 41, 42. I mean, economists disagree exactly where the bottom is, but you get roughly 20 years, let's say the boom that started in the late 50s and early 60s went all the way to 68. Some economists would say that it peaked in 72. That's not as important exactly where, or sorry, when the boom of the 60s peaked. What's important is that the bust lasted up until 1980. Many economists would even actually argue or say that the bust ended in 1982. But you take the whole 60s and the whole 70s, and you get a roughly boom-bust of a total 20 years. Oh, you have a question? Okay, is it true that if the boom, what? Is longer than what? That inflation? Okay, so now I understand your question. Is it true that if the boom lasts longer, then the bust will last longer? Okay, so the answer to this is not necessarily. What is true is that the longer is the boom, the overall bust will be harder. You may get a boom of 15 years or 10 years. In the US, the longest one has been recorded from 1990 all the way to 2010 years. And you may get a real hard bust that will last a very short period of time. Or you may get, as in the case of Japan, where it had the boom from early 1980 all the way to 1990, it had a 10-year boom. But the bust has been very slow, very gradual, with relatively little pain, lasting for 17 long years. So the answer is, cumulatively, the bust will do what it's supposed to do. You may have 2 extremely hard and painful years and be done with the bust, or you may have 17 relatively painless years and still keep going through the bust. Okay? So it is the total cumulative effect that's got to occur, which is during the boom you accumulate certain malinvestments. So the bust has got to liquidate those investments. And you can liquidate them real fast and move on, or you can liquidate them for 2 decades and still not move on. You had a question?
What if the boom is based on production and not on credit expansion? If it's sustainable, then what would cause Okay, so let's write one for you. Because it's an important characteristic. Booms are never, ever sustainable. By definition, they are unsustainable. You can never get a sustainable boom. If it were sustainable, we have a completely different word for it. We call it growth. We call it economic growth. In other words, the fundamentals of booms are never sound. Booms are never sustainable. In other words, they are unsustainable. And booms are doomed always to end in a bust. Doesn't sound right? What's the difference between a boom and growth?
Okay, so what's the difference? That's the excellent question. I'll spend the time next lecture in a couple of that. The difference is in fundamentals. Fundamentally, the boom is based on credit expansion, which is expanding credit that is not backed by savings. On the other hand, economic growth is based on increased savings and increased credit, which is based on increased savings. So both of them begin because of an expansion in credit, because of an increase in credit. But in an economic growth, savings has increased to back in a sustainable manner the growth, meaning the boom or the expansion, while in the business cycle there is no corresponding increase in savings to back the boom part. So eventually you run out of savings in order to complete all the investments made during the boom and to make them profitable. Again, that's part of a theory of business cycles, which I'll be doing probably in the next 2 or 3 lectures. Have more questions? No. Okay. So, unsustainable, another fundamental characteristic. Okay, the next one is amplitude. And amplitude is simply how high the boom rises and how low the bust begins. So if I will have to draw a picture, this peak has a relatively, and this bust has a relatively small amplitude relatively to this one, which is a much higher amplitude on the way up and much lower amplitude on the way down. So amplitude represents the difference between the peak and the trough. It represents the range of movement. It is the same thing as in engineering and electronics. This graph over here has a relatively low amplitude. This graph here has a much higher amplitude, let's say 4 or 5 times higher. So, for business cycles, fundamental characteristics is that amplitude is of varying degrees. So you have a varying amplitude. So some booms will have a very large amplitude on the way up and possibly or very likely a large amplitude on the way down. Some will have a relatively small amplitude on the way up and correspondingly on the way down. Also, what you may have is a relatively fast rise on the way up, and rather than have a low point here after a sharp correction, you may have a relatively, again, prolonged depression, and this one here is a whole lot less painful than this one here. Of course, this one may last 10 years and this one may last 2 years, but a bust has got a job to do, as we will study in coming lectures. Certain things have to happen in order for a bust to be complete, as we will study. And whether it takes 2 years in a really fast and painful manner, or it takes 10 years in a slow and relatively painless manner, is up to other things to decide. But things gotta happen in order for the bust to be over. Is it fairly clear? Any questions at this point? None? Okay. So, another characteristic, number 7, is that of rhyming. In other words, business cycles are not identical. They're never the same. They never have the same amplitude and the same period. They rhyme. In other words, they're usually similar, but you cannot expect them to have the same rise. You don't expect them to have the same amplitude, the same wavelength. In other words, same amplitude, the same periodicity. So they usually are similar. They rhyme. But what you may possibly expect, especially in these modern days, late 20th century, is that they will be relatively synchronous from country to a country. Synchronous would mean that as the Bulgarian economy is roughly bottoming, for example, the Romanian economy will be roughly bottoming. As the Bulgarian economy is moving upwards, the Romanian economy will be moving upwards. When Bulgarian economy is roughly peaking, so will be, within maybe a year sooner or maybe a year later, the Romanian economy. So they are rhyming, and that's a fundamental characteristic. Have a question? Okay, so it is not for neighboring countries, it is for countries with fundamentally similar characteristics. It may be relatively, so say, for Eastern European countries, but possibly to be correlated with Latin American countries, okay? So if they have similar characteristics, which imply sometimes similar banking systems, more importantly would imply similar capital inflows and possibly similar capital outflows. In other words, if the fundamentals of the economy, which we call the economic structure in general, is similar, there may be a good chance that they will be very similar. Their business cycles will be relatively similar to each other. I mean, for some countries they may be fundamentally different, so you don't have to expect them to rhyme. More questions? None? Okay. Then I have smoothing and severity. Smoothing. So, what are the fundamental questions that we should answer, and I'll certainly not do that today, but in coming lectures, is whether the government should smooth the business cycle. They should try to smooth the business cycle. And here you have a lot of disagreements. Well, I'll be explaining that in the future. Now, if the government is trying to smooth, now, do you understand what smoothing would mean? Well, smoothing would mean that the government is trying to lower the amplitude of the business cycle. Again, that's fancy engineering terms, but you would not want to have the boom to be peaking as high, so that when a bust occurs, the bust is not as deep, but shallower. So the overall amplitude on the way up is lower, and the overall amplitude on the way down is also lower. Now you will have economists disagreeing as to whether governments should try only to smooth the downward portion or the bust. And some of the old school economists claim or argue that governments should not allow the boom to get out of hand or to accelerate much beyond the long-term capability of the economy to grow. And if they don't allow the economy to grow much faster than its long-term growth, then you will not get a correspondingly deep bust. So, question in general is, should smoothing occur? Should the smoothing occur on the way up during the boom? Or should you let the boom run as high as possible and then try to smooth the economy on the way down? That is, very controversial. This process of smoothing has a standard term in economics, and we call that stabilisation. So, stabilizing the business cycle is usually what concerns economists and macroeconomic policymakers, and stabilization occurs with the two fundamental tools of macroeconomic policy, and these tools are monetary policy and fiscal policy. So, stabilization through monetary policy, and two, through fiscal policy. Okay? So, this is not clear. This is controversial. We'll discuss this later down the road. But it's one of the questions that we need to answer. In essence, whether we should smooth or not smooth may be also some of the problems that we have to explain in general, which is explain what is the most appropriate reaction to a bust, okay? Or in general, to the business cycle, because the reaction may not be during the bust. It may be the appropriate reaction should be during the boom, not to let the boom get out of hand. Okay, is it fairly clear so far? All right, let's see what else I have. This is also known, I have in my notes yet another term, is known as taming the business cycle. taming the business cycle. We could phrase it in Shakespearean way. The question is to tame or not to tame the business cycle, and what's the most appropriate way to do that. Okay, so now I'm going to discuss a little bit some concepts related to cyclicality, and the concept is associated with how different variables peak and trough during the business cycle. So what you have first of all is procyclical and procyclicality. A variable is procyclical if it expands or rises or grows during the boom and contracts or goes down during the bust. Anyone can give procyclical examples of procyclical variables? Capital, but not quite capital. We'd better say investments. Investments. What else? Consumption. Excellent. Consumption is clearly procyclical. Inflation, but not necessarily. To some extent, for example, the boom of the 60s had a relatively low inflation, and the bust of the 70s had a very high inflation. So this is an example where inflation is not procyclical, all right? Actually, 1920s and 30s represent also the opposite. During the boom, inflation is up, and during the bust, inflation is down, which means that it is procyclical during the 20s and 30s. But it is not during the 60s and 70s. For this, we have the second concept. The second concept is acyclical. In other words, it's neither procyclical nor contracyclical. So now I have to explain the next concept, which is contracyclical or countercyclical, sometimes which is actually better known as countercyclical, and some economists would use contracyclical. So contracyclical is a variable that moves in the opposite direction to the overall economy. Can anyone come up with an example? Unemployment, excellent. That's the top choice. Yes, indeed. During a boom, when the economy is rising, unemployment's going down. And during a bust, when the economy is going down, unemployment is rising. So unemployment is the perfect example of a contracyclical variable. So we have procyclical, which moves with the business cycle. You have contracyclical or countercyclical, which moves against the business cycle. We have acyclical, which moves not quite related to the cycle. And then we have two more which apply for both procyclical and countercyclical. It's easier to think in terms of, let's say, procyclical, which is leading variables. So, a leading variable is a variable that peaks before the business cycle itself peaks, and correspondingly it troughs before the business cycle troughs. Let me draw a picture for you so that you can actually see this as an illustration. So that will be a leading variable, and then the other concept is that of a lagging variable. Lagging variable will be a variable that peaks after the business cycle has peaked and troughs after the business cycle has bottomed. So what would that look like? Well, here is time, here is the business cycle. It sometimes helps to have the long-term trend line. So what you may have now is a leading variable. A leading variable will peak. If this is the peak of the business cycle, then the leading variable will peak somewhere over here. So it will be peaking before, and it will turn downward while the overall business cycle is still going up, and then it will bottom again before the business cycle bottoms. And similarly, you had a question?
Before in time. Before in time.
Before in time. In other words, it may peak with a higher amplitude, or it may peak with a lower amplitude. But it's before the business cycle peaks. In other words, what you have is an offset in time. So if in time it peaks before, in other words, peaks left of the business cycle, then it's a lagging variable. Well, I don't have a third color, but if you, sorry, oops, my mistake, guys, a leading variable. And if it peaks after, and to peak after, I'll kind of have it dotted for you. If it peaks after, you see it may peak even higher. This will represent a lagging variable. So this is a lagging variable, and this is a leading variable. Is it fairly clear what leading? Okay, and the last one is considered or called coincident. Coincident means that it peaks exactly when the business cycle peaks, and it bottoms exactly when the business cycle bottoms. In other words, peaks at the same time as business cycle. So, leading peaks before the business cycle peaks, coincident at the same time, and lagging afterwards. Coincident, actually, very hard to give examples of coincidence because they are extremely rare. The one that is known and documented is investments. It's the one and only, actually, as we'll study next lecture. What I have prepared for you guys during the next lecture is cover 17 or 18 macroeconomic variables, key, important. We'll explain which these variables are, what they mean, and whether they are leading or lagging. And also very important to understand is that a macroeconomic variable may be leading during the boom and afterwards lagging during the bust. So it does not have to have lead at the top and lead at the bottom. It may lead at the top and lag at the bottom. Or vice versa. It may lag at the top and lead at the bottom. So some variables will be strictly leading, others lagging, etc. So investments will be one such example. I don't want to get into those variables now simply because I have a full 75-minute lecture on that topic, because it's important to clarify, to understand some more real stuff of what's going on. Okay? Other questions? Well, what I have then is simply a short discussion of modern business cycle theories. In our 400 level course, I do teach for almost half a semester business cycle theory and business cycles in general. So I teach early 18th century business cycle theories. I do teach about a dozen or so 19th century theories. I teach probably almost a dozen of 20th century theories. So, sorry, a dozen 20th century theories, yeah. So my point is, you have at least a couple of dozen of various business cycle theories. So that's number one. Number two, to understand that most of them are extremely controversial. Number 3 is that economists still cannot agree which theories are good, which theories are bad. They're still arguing about that. Now, as a general introduction, what I can say is the top or the leading modern day theories, those that to some extent have not been completely rejected, that are found to be okay and acceptable. And the first one doesn't mean the best, just means the first of the 5 is monetarism, developed by Milton Friedman. And again, I'm not going to discuss any of that in this class. On each of these 5, I spend a lecture, and possibly on some of them, let's say on New Keynesian theory, 2 lectures in the other class, but it's a 400 level advanced course specializing in growth and business cycles. So, monetarism is the first still leading, still dominant theory, still accepted theory. It has its own drawbacks. Economists recognize what's not good about it. They recognize what's good about it, and it's considered a leading one. The second one is the New Keynesian theory of the business cycle. Early on, Keynes, when he developed it and outlined in his 1936 book, which is considered the birth of macroeconomics, we call this Keynes's theory of business cycles. Later on, because his book was very hard to read and understand, there became interpreters, other economists that interpreted Keynes's book. They misinterpreted a lot of the key portions of what Keynes originally had in mind and wrote about. So those interpreters are called Keynesians. Then in the 60s, and especially in the 70s, Keynesianism, as reflected by those Keynesians, had new changes. So they are called Neo-Keynesians. So that represented the development that school became to New Keynesian school. Mid to late 70s, there has been disenchantment with the Keynesian school. In other words, Keynesians predicted there is a complete and full trade-off between inflation and unemployment. And if you get a problem with unemployment, you crank some more inflation, and that will take care of the unemployment. Well, 70s proved this to be fundamentally wrong. It was just dead wrong. So this led to a crisis in the Keynesian or New Keynesian school of business cycles. So at that point, New Keynesians were bankrupt. The theory was bankrupt. So later on, there has been a revival in the 80s and especially in the 90s, and that school is called New Keynesian school. So modern day Keynesians are called New Keynesians. So the New Keynesian school explaining business cycles is the second leading one. Another one that was born during the stagflationary 70s associated with oil shocks was that of real business cycles. So it's called RBC, real business cycles. And the theory postulates that the economy or the business cycle depends on various shocks. Essentially, if you have to look or remember, essentially what the theory stipulates is that the business cycle is a sequence or succession or various fluctuations. Each one-time shock, but you get a couple of negative one-time shocks and the economy spins into a recession. Then you get a sequence of positive shocks. Positive shocks, these are most likely one-time shocks, and the economy is booming again. So from that point of view, it is not even considered a business cycle theory, but that's what it was called. People believed in it for maybe a decade or so. So it is a major theory in modern economic thought. Then you have the rational expectations theory of the business cycle. I wouldn't go into that in explaining what it is, but essentially what it's saying is, well, people aren't that stupid. If the government starts printing money, people will be expecting that inflation will accelerate over time. Rational expectations usually say that people will reflect in their inflation expectations or inflationary expectations all available information from, of all that they have or know. They'll adjust their inflationary expectations accordingly. And the business cycle is heavily dependent on how people expect inflation to develop in the future. So again, I'm not going to go into that. And the last one is Austrian, ABCT, Austrian Business Cycle Theory. Modern mainstream economists completely reject it. Actually, they don't even bother rejecting the theory. They simply don't recognize it even to exist, as if it's not there and present. And that's in academia. In the real world, in the investing world, where people put millions, but more likely billions, into investments, Austrian business cycle theory is the preferred tool. It is considered the better one. Clearly, it has the best capability to explain the business cycle, to explain what's going on, but much better, it's got the ability to forecast better than any other. As you know, or should know by now, I've grown over the last couple of years, maybe 6 or 7 years, to become an Austrian economist, mostly because I've seen that all the other mainstream business cycle theories are just flat wrong. They don't forecast anything right or correct. All mainstream economists, by definition, get it wrong. Unfortunately, that's what the reality of today is. And I've seen and convinced myself over the last 7 years that Austrians simply get it right. They explain it better. They see what's going on. They forecast how things will develop in different markets. And I have adopted the Austrian theory of business cycles simply because I've seen it to work much better. And therefore, you'll get a decent dose of it in this course, meaning 2 more lectures on explaining the Austrian theory of business cycles. It is a little bit more complicated than the others, but not much more. Now that we have studied theory of interest and capital, it's fairly easy, it's fairly straightforward, and also perfectly logical. And now that we've studied already economic growth, it should make really perfect sense to you, but it's going to take maybe 2, maybe 3 lectures to get through some of the details, and that's where we're heading next week. For the next lecture, what we'll discuss is leading, lagging variables, etc. We have like 5 minutes left. Do you guys have any questions? Anything to clarify?
What is it basically based on, the Austrian theory?
It's based on... Okay, well, that was what I wanted to discuss down the road. It's based on, number 1, the theory of money, as we have studied it appropriately. It is based on the theory of credits, and it's based on the theory of interest. It's based on the theory of capital, based on fractional reserve banking. So it is based on pretty much everything that we have done so far. Let's put it differently. In macroeconomics, the capstone in the subject of macroeconomics, the real pinnacle, the hard stuff is business cycles. This is where economists disagree the most. This is also what's fundamentally the hardest in macroeconomics. So, business cycles are by far the hardest one. Now, there is a completely different way to think about it, and a completely different way to think about it is that the subject of macroeconomics is business cycles. Wealth of Nations, written by Adam Smith, which is today considered to be the birth of economics was about what? The wealth of nations. In other words, it was about standards of living, which was about fundamentally economic growth. So, the birth of economics was economic growth. The birth of macroeconomics, which today is considered to be 1936, Austrians will argue with that, but 1936 with Keynes's general theory, it was all about business cycles. So a better modern view of macroeconomics is that macroeconomics is simply the subject of business cycles. In a sense, everything you do or we do and study in macroeconomics for 11 weeks now is all ultimately about understanding what business cycles are. Simply because business cycles are the subject of macroeconomics. Is this answering question? Any other questions, guys? Anybody? None? Well, I guess then we're done for today. I'll be seeing you next time discussing leading, lagging variables, etc. Okay?